They refused her credit at the mercantile, but a quiet man leaning against the livery saw her shame and said, "Come with me. I'll make sure you eat tonight." Dakota Territory, 1886. A bitter wind, sharp as a skinning knife, swept down from the Black Hills, carrying the iron scent of snow yet to fall. Eleanor Vance stood on the warped wooden boards outside the general store, an empty flour sack clutched in her gloveless hands. Her fingers, pale and stiff, were numb not just from the cold, but from a deeper, chilling shame. Hope, like the flour she couldn't afford, had been a thin and dwindling commodity for months. Inside, the storeman hadn't even met her eyes. "No more credit," he'd stated flatly, his voice ringing with finality as he turned to fiddle with a bolt of calico. The words landed not as sound, but as a physical blow to her chest, driving the air from her lungs. She didn't plead. Pride was all she had left to wrap around herself. She simply gave a tight, sharp nod, lifted her chin against the trembling she felt in her throat, and stepped off the plank walkway into the frozen mud of the street. Her daughter, little Lily, had eaten nothing but thin broth scraped from yesterday's pot for 2 days. The hollow look in the child's eyes that morning was a weight, a stone of failure that sat permanently in Eleanor's belly. She would not let her tears fall here. Not in the middle of this dusty, bustling town, where every passing glance from a homesteader's wife or a cowboy felt like a judgment, a branding of her inadequacy. The settlement throbbed with life around her, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer shaping iron, the rough shouts of teamsters backing their wagons, the laughter spilling from the saloon doors. But she moved through it like a ghost, isolated within a bubble of silent despair. Then, a figure caught her eye, a still point in the chaotic current. A man stood propped against a weathered corral post, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing the upper half of his face. His coat was worn soft at the elbows and cuffs, but it was clean, brushed free of trail dust. He watched her, not with the idle curiosity of the others, but with a focused, rooted stillness, as if he were a tree grown right through the boardwalk. "They turned you away," he said. His voice was low and calm, yet it carried perfectly across the 10 feet of cold air between them, devoid of pity, merely stating a fact. Eleanor halted, the mud sucking at her worn boots. "I'll manage," she replied, the lie tasting like ash. Her own voice was barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. He pushed off the post with a deliberate slowness. "Ride with me," he said, as if offering a neighbor a lift to church. "You'll have a full supper tonight. Your girl, too." "You don't know me," she breathed out, her grip on the empty sack so tight the coarse fabric bit into her palm. "I know enough," he answered, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I see a mother with empty hands and a child waiting somewhere." He took a single step closer. "This isn't charity. It's a meal. A neighborly act. Now, come on." Something in his tone, a firmness woven with an unexpected gentleness, a command that held no room for shame, made the last of her resistance drain away, leaving her weary to the bone. She looked at him fully, then. His face was a map of hard living, lines etched at the corners of his eyes from squinting against sun and distance, his skin weathered like old saddle leather. But his eyes, when she finally met them, held a quiet depth, a calm pool beneath the surface roughness. After a long moment that stretched between the sounds of the town, she nodded, a single dip of her chin. "Name's Jeremiah Cole," he said, turning and leading her toward a stout, mud-splattered wagon where a patient bay horse stood hitched. "You can ride up on the seat beside me." "Eleanor Vance," she answered, finding a strange strength to lift her foot onto the iron step and haul herself up. The worn wood of the seat was cold. "My girl is at our claim. Asadi, east of the Willow Creek." He gathered the reins, his scarred hands moving with practiced ease. "Then we're headed east," he said, and flicked the leather lines. The wagon rolled out of the town's noisy grasp, the wheels crunching over frozen ruts in a slow, rhythmic creak. The late afternoon sun, weak and pale, bled a watery gold across the vast, endless prairie. Eleanor found herself staring at his hands where they held the reins. They were broad, scarred across the knuckles, the nails clean but blunt, hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest labor, holding plow handles, splitting wood, fixing what was broken. They held the lines not with tension, but with an easy, confident certainty. When the low, grassy mound of their sod house finally came into view, a stark hump against the flat land, her heart clenched like a fist. A tiny, wraith-like figure stood in the dark doorway, a smudge of faded calico against the earth. "That her?" Jeremiah asked, his voice softening just a degree. "Lily," Eleanor said, the name a prayer on her lips. "She's 6 years old." "She looks keen," he observed, and there was a hint of something like admiration in the words. He didn't wait for ceremony. From the back of the wagon, he began to unload a small treasury, a hefty sack of cornmeal, another of salt, a burlap bag of potatoes, a cloth-wrapped parcel of bacon that made her mouth water involuntarily, and finally, a haunch of smoked venison, dark and rich. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. "I can't possibly, this is too much." "Let's get a fire going," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Cold setting in. Inside, the soddy was dim and carried the eternal, cool scent of packed earth. But soon, the small cookstove glowed, pushing back the shadows with a flickering, orange warmth. He moved with a quiet, unhurried efficiency, finding the knife and a cutting board as if he'd lived there for years, dicing potatoes into perfect cubes while Eleanor, in a daze, mixed cornbread batter. Lily watched from the corner, her big eyes wide, tracking the stranger's every move, captivated by the promise that now had a form and a scent. "You handle a kitchen like you were raised to it," Eleanor remarked, the normalcy of the conversation feeling foreign. "I was," he said, not looking up from his precise cuts. "My mother passed when I was young." "A boy learns by doing or goes hungry." "And your father?" she ventured. "Gone before memory," he said, the words simple, final, a door gently closed. He didn't ask about the absence of a man's boots by the door, the singular pillow on the narrow bed. She offered no explanation. Some histories were too heavy, their wounds too fresh, to be unpacked on a first meeting. But as the cast-iron pot began to bubble, filling the low-ceilinged room with the rich, savory scent of stewing meat and herbs, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of peace began to settle in the corners. It displaced, just for a while, the constant, gnawing worry that had lived with them for so long. Later, with Lily tucked beneath a patchwork quilt and lost in deep sleep, Eleanor stepped outside into the vault of the night. The sky was a breathtaking tapestry, an endless spill of stars so sharp and bright they seemed within reach. Jeremiah stood a few feet away, his head tilted back, looking up at the cosmos in silence. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling painfully inadequate for the avalanche of feeling inside her. "Was my intention," he replied simply, his gaze still upward. "You're a good man, Jeremiah Cole." He shook his head slightly, a shadow of a movement. "Just a man doing what's plainly right. Nothing more." "It's been a long, long while since right found its way to our door," she whispered, the truth of it aching in her voice. He finally turned his head toward her, his profile silhouetted against the starry sky. "Doesn't have to be the last time." The air between them seemed to shift, to crackle with a new and terrifying possibility, a door to a future she had forcibly sealed shut years ago. "Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I do," he said. 2 syllables that felt like a cornerstone being laid. He was gone after first light, the deep tracks of his wagon wheels the only proof he hadn't been a dream born of hunger and desperation. But by mid-morning, as she scrubbed a pot with sand, the familiar, rhythmic creak of wheels and the soft snore of a horse carried on the still air. Her pulse leaped, a wild bird in her chest. He'd come back. He found the broken hinge on the rickety stable door and mended it with spare nails from his pocket. He showed Lily, with infinite patience, how to tie a proper bowl and knot, her small fingers fumbling over the loop. He sat in their one good chair by the hearth that evening, the firelight etching the patient, quiet lines of his face into something beautiful and strong. Over a simple supper of the leftover stew, the silence that enveloped them was no longer the empty silence of strangers or the heavy silence of loneliness. It was a companionable quiet, the kind that exists between people who are no longer watching the clock. "You plan on moving on?" she asked carefully days later, her eyes fixed on her empty plate, fearing the answer. "The trails will be clear soon." "Do you want me to?" he asked in return, his voice level. Her gaze flew up to meet his. The directness of his question, the way it handed the power of his destiny to her, held her utterly still. "No," she whispered, the word a release of breath she hadn't known she was holding. "I don't." "Then I'm staying." The declaration was quiet, matter-of-fact, and as absolute as the earth beneath their feet. Winter closed its fist around the claim, snow falling in great, silent waves, muffling the world in a thick white blanket. Jeremiah worked tirelessly through it, mending harness, hauling water from the creek hole he'd chopped open, teaching Lily the names of winter birds. She began to call him Mr. Jeremiah with a tone of pure reverence. One particularly bitter night, with the wind howling like a lost thing, the child finally asleep, Eleanor found the courage to speak of the past. The words came haltingly at first, then in a slow stream, of her husband, Thomas, his laugh, his strong hands, and the cruel randomness of the logging accident that took him, of the subsequent, relentless struggle to hold on to this patch of dirt he'd loved, each day a battle against debt, weather, and despair. Jeremiah listened, his eyes on the flames, not interrupting, just absorbing the weight of her story. When her voice finally faded, he shared fragments of his own long road, years spent driving cattle herds north through dust and storm, back-breaking seasons laying grade for the railroads, a rootless existence walking from one job to the next, searching without knowing what he was looking for. "A man can walk 1,000 miles and still be lost," he said, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "He can have a full canteen and still be thirsty. It's only when he finds a place that feels like a beginning, and not just another stop, that the walking ends." "Have you?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Found it?" His eyes held hers across the short space between them, the distance feeling suddenly vast and infinitely small. "I believe I'm looking right at it," he said. Spring came as a slow thaw, then a sudden rush of green. Jeremiah broke a new garden plot with the plow he'd repaired. He traded for a real pane of glass and fitted a proper window into the sod wall, so Lily could watch the world from her bed. In early summer, when the wild roses bloomed along the creek bank, they were married by a traveling minister. The ceremony took place under the old, sheltering oak Thomas had once loved. Lily stood proudly, holding the simple, polished silver band Jeremiah had traded a good knife for. There was no music, no crowd, no finery. But there was a profound, settled joy that seemed to rise from the very ground, wrapping around the three of them. By the following winter, the pantry in the soddy was stocked with jars of preserves, sacks of grain, and smoked meat. The roof, newly reinforced with fresh sod and timber, held stout against the blizzards. Laughter, once a rare and startled sound, became the constant resident, as familiar as the smell of baking bread. Lily's cheeks grew round and rosy, her laughter quick and easy. The title Mr. was quietly, naturally dropped. She now called him Pa without a second thought, and he answered every time. Some evenings, when the chores were done, Eleanor and Jeremiah would sit on the rough-hewn bench he'd built and placed facing the west, her hand lost in the warm, callous cradle of his, watching the immense prairie sky paint itself in fiery colors before settling into a deep, peaceful dusk. He was still a man of few words. But she had learned, in the months and seasons, to understand the rich language of his silence. It spoke of permanence, of devotion kept not in promises but in daily actions, of a sacred vow upheld. And when he would lean over, his shoulder solid against hers, to press his lips gently to her temple, she would close her eyes, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and honest sweat, knowing with unshakable certainty that this wasn't an ending. It was the deep, firm foundation of everything they had yet to build. If stories of resilience, quiet strength, and the families we find speak to you, please do this channel a great kindness, hit the like button and subscribe to Winds of Thought. Your support is what allows us to bring more of these tales to life.